male get come a rotten bale. Too much monkey business, too much monkey business. There's too much monkey business for me to be my hand.
Good evening and welcome to the second evening of Apesploitation, the 2010 Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Gardens Summer Camp Film Festival. My name is Dave Wilt, and if you were here last week, I'm glad to see you back. I'm your host. I'm here to try to impose some order and reason on this chaotic world of ours, or reason on the films we're showing. Tonight's feature is a 1961 film, Konga. But before I go into too much detail on Konga, I would like to talk about a few other things besides the specific film. And I thought we'd go inside the gorilla suit, so to speak. Last year's Summer Camp Film Festival, we talked and we showed Godzilla movies, which was what I call a man in the suitosaurus, a guy in a monster suit. And a couple of years ago, we did Ray Corrigan films, and those were stop-motion animated monsters. And now, of course, in today's movies, we have the third option. Besides a guy in a suit and besides stop-motion, we have computer-generated images, or CGI, which appears in practically every movie you see now. However, we are having not man in a suitosaurus, but what I like to call gorilla-suitomation this year. Ironically, and we'll talk a little bit more about this next week, but the various versions of the most famous giant gorilla movie, King Kong, present a sort of spectrum of special effects. The 1933 King Kong, the very famous first one, used stop-motion animation, which is a little model, and you move it at incremental, take a picture, you move a little more, you take a picture, and when you run all those pictures together, it looks like it's moving. The 1975 King Kong remake by Dino De Laurentiis was mostly man in a suit. There were some mechanical models, but it was mostly gorilla-suitomation, as they call it. And then, of course, the most recent King Kong, Peter Jackson's version, was mostly computer-generated images. The Apesploitation pictures we're seeing this year, however, are all gorilla-suitomation. They're all basically a guy wearing a fur costume. Last week, it was just a guy in a fur costume. This week and next week, it's a guy in a gorilla costume, filmed as he's wrecking teeny tiny little miniature buildings to make him giant. You know, this particular movie, they call it spectimation, but basically what it is a guy in a gorilla suit stepping on little bitty buildings. If you were here last week and you watched Gorilla at Large, you might find tonight's gorilla rather familiar because it's the exact same costume. It's not the same guy who's inside the costume, but it's the same costume. Hollywood in the 1930s, 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s was a big place. There was a lot of movies being made, and later on a lot of television shows. It was so big, in fact, that steady work was available not just for one guy who had a gorilla suit, but for multiple guys with multiple gorilla suits. Yes, gorilla-impersonator was somebody's job. The studios didn't own the costumes. It was a guy, an actor, who owned the costume, and whenever Three Stooges or Abbott and Costello or a horror movie or Beverly Hillbillies or something like that needed a gorilla, the casting directors knew who to call. The man inside the gorilla suit in Gorilla at Large, which we saw last week, was named George Barrows. And he wasn't the first or the most prolific gorilla man, but since we saw him last week and we'll see his costume at least this week, I thought I'd mention him first. And actually what I've done is I put together a little clip here with some highlights from George's career. It's rather short, and it actually shows him also outside of his costume at the very end of this first clip. You'll see what George looks like when he's not playing a gorilla. And this is tonight's movie. As I said, it's not George in the suit, but George's suit. The savage fury of the gorilla.
Thank you, George. Well spoken.
Yes, George Barrows, the Gorilla Man. As far as Konga is concerned, George didn't make the trip to England to shoot this movie. He just rented the costume to producer Herman Cohen, shipped it over there, and a British performer handled the title role of the film. Reportedly, George wasn't too happy when he got the suit back because they didn't groom it properly, and also they poked a bunch of holes in it for ventilation purposes. And as you saw from the clips and the pictures I showed, George's gorilla suit is quite distinctive with its sort of odd pear-shaped head. It's kind of a bump on top of his head. As I said before, George is not and was not the most famous gorilla man in Hollywood. One of the earliest was in fact a sculptor and makeup artist named Charles Gemora, who worked in films from the 1920s up to the 1960s, both in technical areas as a makeup artist and a sculptor, and playing a gorilla actor. Here's a clip with two early examples, one from the both from the 1930s, in fact. One of them is actually a test from a film that was never released. The other actually shows Charles being unmasked as a gorilla in a comedy film. Considering this is early 30s and Charles made this suit himself, it's pretty impressive. And as I said, this is test footage, and so it's rather rare